What would you do if you knew you were marching towards certain death, and history would barely remember your name? Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with 299 other warriors, watching an empire darken the horizon. No escape. No reinforcements. Just duty. Just defiance. This is not a myth. This is the story of how 300 men chose immortality over survival. Before we step onto that battlefield, make sure you subscribe and like this video. If you love epic history, untold strategy, and the real stories behind legendary battles, you're in the right place. And trust me, what really happened at Thermopylae is even more powerful than the legend. Now tell me in the comments, if you had been there, knowing the odds, would you have stood your ground, or would you have chosen to live? I want to know what you think before we continue. Imagine the entire might of an empire stretching to the horizon, banners like a moving sea, campfires wheeling across valleys, engineers and beasts and ships formed into an armada meant to erase resistance. Now imagine 300 men standing in its way. Not a fortress, not a hidden trap, just a narrow strip of land pressed between mountain and sea, the Hot Gates, Thermopylae. In the summer of 480 BC, those men turned a corridor into a crucible, and for 3 days they forged a delay that would ripple through history. To understand why a Persian king would send such a force, and why a Spartan king would answer with so few, we need to rewind a decade. In 490 BC, at Marathon, a Persian expedition led by Datis and Artaphernes was checked by Athenian hoplites. That earlier clash did not end Persia's ambition. It stung an empire and left a grudge. Darius the Fu, who had begun the first punitive campaign against Greece, died before he could finish it. His son, Xerxes I, inherited not only a throne, but a mission, political, personal, imperial. He would assemble a force meant to be irresistible, to punish and to secure his western flank. The Persian invasion that set sail in 480 BC was both retribution and empire-making. Xerxes' campaign was an exercise in logistics and spectacle. The king did not merely gather soldiers, he bent geography to his will. To move a fleet and army across the narrow Hellespont, his engineers built a pontoon bridge, ships lashed together, cables across the strait, an audacious practical answer to the problem of crossing the sea. At Mount Athos, his engineers dug a canal so ships could avoid a treacherous cape. These works were not rituals, they were strategic enablers that allowed an army to project power across waters and mountains. Ancient authors, especially Herodotus, painted a portrait of Xerxes' host so vast that it approaches the mythical, a host of millions, a fleet with thousands of vessels. Modern scholarship reads those numbers with a cautious eye. Herodotus wrote from the vantage of oral reports and imperial awe. Contemporary estimates place the invading force in the low hundreds of thousands at most, still massive for the ancient world, but far from the boundless tide a literal reading of the ancient texts might imply. The point remains, Xerxes' invasion was a near unprecedented concentration of manpower, resources, and imperial will. From across Asia Minor, Egypt, and subject peoples marched contingents, cavalry, archers, light infantry, and the famed elite units the Greeks would call immortals. A standing elite force of the Persian army, highly trained and equipped to strike decisive blows. Opposite that imperial colossus stood Greek city-states riven by rivalry. The idea of unified resistance was fragile. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and others debated strategy and contributed men and ships to a risky plan. Hold the Persian advance at key choke points and prevent the fleet from outflanking an army standing on the line. Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, offered such a choke point. A coastal pass where a narrow strip of land pins the sea against steep slopes. It could deny numerical advantage. To hold it required more than courage. It demanded discipline. Sparta embodied discipline. From childhood, Spartans were molded into a militarized society through the agage, a state-sponsored training regimen that emphasized endurance, obedience, and the collective ideal. Spartan boys were raised to become shields first, both literally and metaphorically. The shield, or hoplon, did not represent personal glory. It represented the line. To lose your shield was to abandon your position and dishonor your family. Their creed favored communal cohesion over individual survival. Men who carried the shield together learned to move as one. Leonidas, by many accounts, a king of Sparta from the Agiad line, was chosen to lead the Spartans' contribution to the allied force. The number he took famously, 300, is itself a story embedded in Spartan custom. According to sources that the Greeks preserved, the men chosen had to be able to produce heirs. They were not the impoverished or the childless who could be spared. They were elite, seasoned warriors, each representing a household, each chosen to embody Sparta's sacrificial ethic. King Leonidas and his 300 were the hinge around which the defense at Thermopylae turned. Thermopylae's geography made this stand possible. The pass was narrow, so narrow that a formation's width mattered more than its depth. The hoplite phalanx, the dominant heavy infantry formation in Greece, depended on that intimacy. A hoplite was armed and armored in a recognizable kit, the hoplon, or aspis, a heavy, round shield concave enough to brace on the forearm, the doru, a long spear used for thrusting, a short sword for close work, and a bronze helmet and cuirass that deflected blows. In formation, shields overlapped, spears projected, and the front rank's spears created a bristling hedge facing the enemy. A phalanx moving forward was mass and momentum concentrated in a disciplined line. On an open plain, a phalanx could be turned or outflanked by cavalry or by more mobile troops. In a narrow pass, the line could resist a much larger force because the enemies could not bring their numbers to bear head-on. The first clash at Thermopylae unfolded with a visceral immediacy. Persian archers released a black rain of arrows that blotted the sun and thudded against bronze and flesh. For the Greeks, the shields rose like a wall. The image is stark. Arrows like storm rain, shields like armor, the phalanx holding. Ancient accounts describe arrows that obscured sight and settled like snow upon the helmets of defenders. Yet the hoplite formation had an advantage in close quarters. When it closed with Persian infantry, lighter armed and more mobile, the Greeks pressed spear points through mail and flesh. The Persians, numerous and flexible, found themselves checked where only a few could engage at a time. Their advantage in numbers was reduced to a matter of attrition. On the second day, according to Greek reports, the Persians tried different approaches. They brought forward elite units, including the famed Immortals. The term Immortals comes from Greek sources describing a Persian guard reputedly kept at a constant number. When one fell, another would replace him, giving the impression of unbroken continuity. Whether the unit matched the novelist's gloss on its name, or simply functioned as a royal guard and elite strike force, it was meant to break lines and seize victory. Yet at Thermopylae, the Immortals met massed bronze and disciplined men. The Greeks used the narrow ground to set up repeated charges and countercharges. They feinted. They retreated carefully to draw the Persians into kill zones. The phalanx functioned like a living battering ram, one that absorbed and returned force. For 2 days, the Persians hurled men against steel and discipline and paid a toll in blood. Then came intelligence and betrayal. The Greek defense depended on controlling the mountain tracks above the pass, the only places where the Persians might maneuver around the Greek position. Local knowledge mattered. A shepherd, named in some accounts Ephialtes, the nightmare in Greek, led Persian guides along a goat path called the Anopa, a hidden track that climbed the spine of the mountains and descended behind the Greek position. Herodotus records this story. Later authors elaborated it. Whether Ephialtes' motivation was treachery, self-preservation, or simple bribery is debated. But his action shifted the tactical picture. If the Persians could outflank the defenders, the choke would be meaningless. By night, the Persians marched an outflanking column. The Phocian contingent tasked with guarding that route either fled or was overwhelmed. Accounts vary. In any case, at dawn on the third day, Xerxes' forces attacked from behind. Now the Greeks faced annihilation. A key moment followed. Leonidas made a decision. He dismissed most of the allied contingents, the Thespians, the Thebans, the contingent of Helots and others, so they might save themselves and preserve men for the continued Greek resistance elsewhere. He remained with his 300, but he was not entirely alone. The Thespians, led by Demophilus, refused to leave. They chose to stay and fight. Some Thebans remained as well. Their motives are complex and contested in the sources, and their later reputation suffered in Greek memory because of perceived collaboration elsewhere. Leonidas's choice was strategic and sacrificial. He denied Xerxes an easy victory before Greek hearts and minds could harden. He bought time. The final stand is one of those moments that resists easy depiction. It was brutal, intimate, and brief. Spears splintered. Men grappled at close range. The battle narrowed to fragments. Greek swords found gaps. Persian blades sought exposed joints. Bodies fell and were pulled backward by the tide of the press. Shields were used not only to ward off blows, but to lever and shove, to create openings for a final thrust. Ancient narratives emphasize scene after scene. Leonidas striking, soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder as the line thinned, the ground around the pass choked with discarded equipment. Some sources tell of horses and chariots stalled in the constriction of the route, others of commanders of the Persian host, seeing their formations crumble as small groups of Greeks would charge and then reform. What happened to Leonidas himself is obscured by the fog of combat and the embellishment of later writers. Herodotus suggests that Leonidas died in the fighting. Later writers add details such as scalping or the decapitation of his body shown on a stake. Stories that serve to show Xerxes' cruelty in the tale tradition. Modern historians caution against treating those grisly anecdotes as confirmed. They are plausible as wartime outrages recorded through enemy eyes and later dramatized. But they are also the kind of detail that lodges in the imagination precisely because it shocks. By the third day, the pass was taken. The Persians had their tactical victory. The path to southern Greece opened. Xerxes pressed on. Athens, crucially, had no significant field army in the path to stop him immediately at Thermopylae. The Athenians, warned by messengers, evacuated the city. Oracle and strategy converged to empty Athens' houses and bring sailors and refugees to the safety of islands and secure ports. Xerxes marched into an emptied city, and his forces plundered temples and homes that had been left behind. This is the moment where the story often darkens. Images of fires and pillaging, of a king who thought himself unrivaled, parading his navy and celebrating victory. But strategic advantage is not only measured by immediate conquest. This is where the shooken empire line earns nuance. Thermopylae, for all its brutal immediacy, was not a decisive end. It was a delay with enormous strategic consequences. The stubborn stand at the pass consumed Persian time and attention. More importantly, it crystallized Greek resolve and bought the necessary breathing room for the naval contest that would follow. The Athenian commander Themistocles had argued for a strategy that linked army and fleet, hold land choke points while the navy met Persia on the sea. The Greek navy, concentrated at Salamis, was not simply a supporting actor. It became the theatre in which Greek fortunes would turn. The Persian fleet, though large and powerful, was vulnerable in the confined waters of the Straits of Salamis. There the Greeks used maneuver, local knowledge, and the cramped geography to negate numerical superiority. The naval victory at Salamis, followed by the land victory at Plataea the next year, 479 BC, ended Xerxes' ambitions in Greece. Thermopylae's sacrifice had bought time. Time for evacuation, time for consolidation, and time for the Greek coalition to focus on a decisive naval showdown. In strategic terms, a small force had produced a disproportionate effect. In cultural terms, the story of Thermopylae rippled even further. A short epitaph, attributed to the poet Simonides and inscribed at the Spartan burial ground, captures the tone the Greeks themselves attached to the sacrifice. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The line reframed defeat as duty fulfilled. Over centuries, the phrase was repeated in poems, histories, and eventually in modern artistic retellings. Herodotus's account, colored by pride, rumor, and moral commentary, became the seedbed for legend. Plutarch and others added interpretations. Later ages would conflate the historical complexity into a compact moral tale. Few against many, courage against autocracy, sacrifice as the seed of freedom. Yet the truth resists simple heroics. Herodotus's narrative includes numbers and speeches colored by the period's conventions. He records Mollen Labe, a laconic reply attributed to Greeks confronting Persian demands to lay down arms, because such lines expressed character. But numbers must be treated carefully. Herodotus lists enormous totals for Xerxes' forces. These figures reflect ancient reportage and rhetorical strategies that emphasized scale to create moral drama. Modern estimates, based on logistics and plausible capacity, usually offer smaller but still formidable numbers. Saying Xerxes had several 100,000 men is not to undercut the terror of the threat. It is to place it in a realistic frame that helps us grasp how extraordinary it was for 300 men to slow an imperial advance. There are also moral and political complexities in the Greek side. The alliance that held Thermopylae was fragile, stitched from city-states that often warred with each other. Sparta's hegemony and the Spartan ideal were not universally adored. The Thebans' role in the stand, some stayed, some surrendered, and others fought elsewhere, shows a spectrum of motivations and loyalties. The Thespians who remained, led by Demophilus, paid with total annihilation alongside the Spartans. Their choice complicates the narrative of Sparta alone as hero. Others shared the stake too. History rarely offers clean moral lines. Militarily, Thermopylae showcased small force tactics against a massed army. The defenders exploited terrain, discipline, and equipment to focus combat into a single dimension where numbers mattered less. The Persians, for all their variety of troops, struggled to execute a concentrated, continuous pressure in that confined geometry. The elite units, the archers, the cavalry, these assets lost much of their edge in the pass. That is why the outflanking maneuver mattered so much. Once the Persian command circumvented the choke, the defenders' advantage evaporated. In that sense, Thermopylae is a lesson in combined arms and the limits of concentrated manpower when geography constrains deployment. Beyond tactics, Thermopylae's real legacy is rhetorical and symbolic. The Spartan sacrifice entered Greek self-understanding as a cornerstone myth. Poets and historians found in it the raw material for arguments about virtue and the polis, what citizens owe one another, and what sacrifice a society can demand. When Rome and later European narrators retold the story, they read their own values into it. Modern retellings, novels, paintings, films, have dramatized and altered the narrative for moral effect. Films like modern graphic adaptations turn the tale into a parable of freedom versus tyranny, often amplifying aspects that serve contemporary narratives. That is not a fault, so much as a reminder. Thermopylae exists both as an event and as a story that successive ages have reshaped. We should return briefly to the human scale at the hot gates. The Spartans trained to hold a line and to die in defense of their city-state's code. That training did not render them invulnerable. It focused their responses. When the phalanx cracked into smaller fights, the brutality of close combat became inescapable. Spears snapped, swords hacked. Men were stripped to their essentials: breath, balance, steel. Yet sources that dwell on gore often do so to moralize or to underline heroism. The more measured accounts emphasize tenacity, discipline, and the quiet dignity of men who understood the cost of their stand. Xerxes' response to the defeat in delay is also revealing. Ancient authors portray him as both furious and superstitious. Accounts of whipping the Hellespont when a storm broke his bridge are famous, perhaps apocryphal. They show a monarch accustomed to commanding nature and subjects, and frustrated when either defied him. He took the captured ground, he saw the bodies, and he thought the war largely won. Yet the delay he absorbed, and the Greek resolve the stand fomented, were strategic setbacks. You cannot measure imperial power only in miles marched and cities taken. Time and morale shape outcomes. Thermopylae became, in Greek memory and in later strategy, an expendable event that yielded a precious strategic boon. The time to fight on terms more favorable in other theaters. In the year after Thermopylae, the Greeks achieved what a handful of defenders at a mountain pass had enabled. The Battle of Salamis saw the Greek fleet, commanded in spirit by Themistocles and executed by captains from various city-states, use the straits to negate Persian numbers and to batter the imperial navy. Ships crashed, lines broke, and a rout followed. Xerxes retreated with part of his army, leaving much of the campaign unfinished. In 479 BC, at Plataea, a Greek field army decisively defeated Persian land forces, and the Persian threat to the Greek mainland effectively ended. Thermopylae had not won those battles, but it had shaped the conditions under which they were won. The cost was real. The dead at Thermopylae were honored by their peers. A monument eventually marked the spot where the Spartans fell, a lion carved in marble that mourns their bravery. The epitaph attributed to Simonides was set to remind passers-by that the fallen died in obedience to their laws. Over centuries, the image of the Spartan stance at Thermopylae became shorthand for self-sacrifice in defense of a common good, and it was packaged into cultural memory in ways both reverent and problematic. We must be careful about what we make Thermopylae mean. It is not a universal blueprint for moral clarity. The Spartans were part of a culture with its own exclusions. Their ideals were forged in a specific political and social context. The Persians were not mere caricatures of despotism. Their empire relied on administration, assimilation, and complex governance across cultures. Xerxes was an emperor seeking to preserve and expand his realm. Labeling one side purely heroic and the other purely monstrous flattens history into caricature. What makes Thermopylae enduring is precisely its ambiguity. A tactical defeat, coupled with moral resonance. An act of violence that also inspired unity among fractious states. In the centuries since, writers have argued that Thermopylae was the moment the West found its heroic exemplar. That claim is contingent and culturally specific. The narrative did travel, poets celebrated it, historians taught it, and artists depicted it. Yet the battle's true legacy is more modest and more powerful. A concrete instance where sacrifice created time, and where time allowed strategy to unfold. The empire, vast as it was, felt the reverberations. The Greek coalition survived and ultimately repelled the invader. That outcome shifted the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean and preserved the conditions for cultural developments that followed in Greece. Political experiments, philosophical inquiry, and art that would shape Mediterranean and Spato-Western thought. Stories like Thermopylae also reveal how memory reshapes events. Each retelling emphasizes selected elements: the heroism, the cruelty, the tactical genius, or the moral lesson. Herodotus wrote at a remove, mixing eyewitness testimony and oral history. Plutarch added moral psychology. Later centuries recast the tale into forms that spoke to their own conflicts. In every age, Thermopylae offered a mirror. What did a society value? Duty, honor, resistance, self-sacrifice. The monument, the epitaph, the poems, and the iconography are the afterlife of a mountain fight. They are why, when we speak of a stand that shook an empire, we mean something more than immediate military outcome. We mean resonance, how an action changes decisions, alters morale, and bends events in ways large armies and kings sometimes miscalculate. There is a final, quieter lesson in Thermopylae. Empires can command vast resources and inflict immediate devastation, but political power rests on more than conquest. It rests on governance, on winning hearts and minds, on the endurance of systems. A tactical victory can still leave an opponent politically invulnerable if the cost accumulates and their cohesion hardens. The men at Thermopylae paid the ultimate price in blood. Their stand did not topple Xerxes' army, but it bought the time for naval and land combinations that would end the campaign and preserve the independence of Greek polities. It sent a message, less military than moral, that men could stand, that resistance could persist, and that strategic patience mattered. Go tell the story as you will. Say it as a lesson in tactics, or as an example of civic duty, or as a parable of sacrifice. Each reading captures a piece of the truth. The hot gates were narrow, and the struggle was brutal. The images, arrows like nightfall, shields pressed together, a last hill smeared with smoke and motion, stick in the mind because they tell a story we still understand. Courage in the face of overwhelming odds and the unexpected power of a few to change many. If this deep dive into Thermopylae spoke to you, subscribe and tell us in the comments which legendary last stand you'd like us to explore next. The Spartans' stand was brutal, and it shook more than a battlefield. It shook decisions, timelines, and the memory that generations would carry forward. Over time, the historical and the mythical braided into a symbol that exceeded its moment and shaped a wider narrative. In the end, the 300, and those who stood with them, left behind not only bones and broken spears, but a pause in an empire's march, and a story that kept people remembering why small acts of resistance sometimes topple the sweep of empires.